Hi, beautiful community. Let's put ourselves with a bit of imaginative self-extraction into Zelensky's shoes and into Putin's shoes, and talk about the way that each of them is kind of cornered while we wait for the Kremlin response to the US-Ukrainian ceasefire proposal. Now, Zelensky's aspiration is to scupper Trump's aspiration to bring the war to a close ASAP. And that's for several reasons. One reason is that Zelensky still is, in my assessment, as he has always been, out with a quarter of an eye to a scenario of an unexpected event or even a black swan event interfering and changing historical circumstances. That could be something happening to Putin or indeed to Trump. And that's not a surprise, because the conception of victory of the Zelensky administration was always predicated on events Ukraine couldn't control. It was predicated on territorial liberation, leading to, by virtue of some contingencies, regime collapse in Russia. So Zelensky is still looking out for a black swan to interfere, such that Ukraine isn't made to choose between carrying the war under difficult circumstances or having a peace that's very difficult. Now, the second reason is one that follows from what we just said. Ukraine is not on course, as things stand, to get security guarantees. So Ukraine is heading for a difficult peace, or a choice between a difficult peace and a difficult continuation of the war. Historically, it tends to be the case that you rarely get peace and justice together. As the wonderful Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit likes to say, peace and justice don't go together like fish and chips. They're like tea and coffee. You often get one or the other. And Ukraine is going to have to choose between an unjust peace or carrying on the war in a way that could be better, but could also be a lot worse than an unjust peace. And Zelensky wants to ward off that choice, because he knows that that's where the Trump administration is driving the story. And therefore, if he can pass the buck onto the Russian side, and that wastes a lot of time, that's going to be absolutely fantastic for Ukraine, not because Zelensky has a solution to this. He doesn't have a solution to this. And he can't have a solution to this, indeed. So he has got an insoluble problem, and he's trying to stretch time before he's forced to reckon with the choice that that problem produces. And then the third reason Zelensky is trying to scupper Trump's ASAP approach is that civil society in Ukraine has not transferred from an original conception of victory that's become implausible to another conception that makes sense and gives a feeling of hopeful optimism around Ukraine's protectedness from Russia and Ukraine's sustainability. So Zelensky wants more time to pass to create more room for a kind of perception of hopeful and sustainable middle ground in outcomes to the war that his own rhetoric has not allowed for a couple of years. So it's a kind of conflict between the kind of discourse that's necessary to motivate a mobilization to defend the country from the Russians may not be the kind of discourse that best places you to make the best choice between a bad and a very bad peace, right? That kind of mobilization may incline you to fluff your lines historically when it comes to needing to choose a bad peace to avoid a very bad one. So I think that's Zelensky's extraordinarily difficult situation, which he is balancing in the context of a radically changing and disordered world. And that's why it's in his interest to stretch this story out as long as possible. Now let's convert to Putin. If Putin accepts the ceasefire unequivocally or with fewer conditions, he will compromise his progress on the line of contact at the front. He will get backlash from the Z radicals. And he may or may not, let's talk about this, have issues with the population. If he rejects the ceasefire, or rejects it by accepting it with many conditions, which Ukraine and the United States can't accept, then he will be risking, in the second order of importance, Trump hardening on Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. But in the first order of importance, Trump becoming less generous in his invitation to renormalize relations with Russia. Now, don't forget, Putin wants to propel Russia from the back row to the front row of nations in some kind of a rapid swoop. And Trump's offer of renormalization speaks to that, renormalization of Russia-Ukraine relations. So the way that historical zigzag that Putin aspires to expresses itself today in March 2025 is via the aspiration to make US-Russia relationships about more than Ukraine, and about more than Ukraine by such an extent that Ukraine is just one issue among others between these two countries. So that's what Putin risks. Now, let's analyze a little bit the Z story and the population story. Putin will be getting backlash, he's already getting backlash if you follow Russian Telegram, from Z radicals. Now, when I say Z radicals, I mean a cluster of different groups. I use the term in a slightly different way to how it's commonly used. I use it to cover the entire umbrella of groups like the folks who are just entrepreneurially parasitizing on the Kremlin, groups that are ideologues of historical return of land that ceased to be part of the same country as Russia at the end of the Soviet period, and then ideologues of what ludicrously and comically Dugin or Prokhanov might call deep Russia, Russian world ideology. So Putin's got to get a zing from there, but he has enough options beyond this agreement to a single month's ceasefire, that agreeing to it for a month will not cause him a great headache with that group. So I don't think the reaction of that umbrella group is going to be decisive for the decision Putin makes. In terms of the population, Putin is completely okay, in fact, but let's give a tiny bit of analysis on that. Historically, we've said that something like 50 or 60% of the Russian population is profoundly depoliticized. Perhaps about 20% plus are inclined to be anti-regime, and in very coherent terms, that's even less, maybe something like 10. And then you've got 20% of people who want more than what Putin is doing. They want not war, but victory. And there again, you'd look at about 20% or 10% if you're looking at the hardcore. The sorts of polling which we should take with a pair of pliers that's coming out from responsible actors like Chronicles or Russian Field suggests that that kind of estimate is still vaguely right. But 40% of respondents tend to say that they would like the war to end on terms that Putin deems appropriate. So that's an outsourcing of the nature of the, termination of the conflict to Putin. Then the next group is probably under 30%, and they prefer to end the war with concessions, if necessary. And then in third place, there's the group that wants victory and not just war, and they take a harder stance, and that's perhaps up to 20%. But these are just vague inclinations that we are, in a very refracted way, perceiving, which we should take with many, many pinches of salt. But roughly speaking, enough Russians are outsourcing their general predilection to have the war end to Putin for this not to be a problem. If we're seeing any minor trends, it's that Trump's pro-Russian rhetoric has rather encouraged a bit of a leakage from the let's end the war on Putin's terms position to let's end the war without making too many concessions, whatever Putin thinks about it. That's just very, very minor. So no, Putin doesn't have a population problem. So where are we with this, right? If I'm evil, what do I recommend Putin here? Well, I recommend Putin to say yes, very strongly and publicly to the ceasefire, but try to insert some conditions that are not so ludicrous as to prevent the US administration from genuinely turning to Ukraine and saying, well, how about this? Can you give that? So throwing the ball back onto the Ukrainian side of the net would be what my evil recommendation to Putin would be, but with a general yes to the ceasefire. And of course, we're going to see what happens in practice. Lots of love.